couple of hundred years ago in Ashbourne in Derbyshire, there was a Methodist preacher who had quite a following locally because he was a very good fire and brimstone preacher and really got his congregation going. And he was in great demand for preaching in his own chapel in Ashbourne, but also in other chapels all around the neighbourhood as well. And he got into a sort of routine that Sunday mornings he would preach in his chapel, then he'd preach in other chapels around the area for the evening service. And this particular event happened one year when suddenly happened to fall on October the 31st. So we now know that's Halloween, but a couple of hundred years ago in Derbyshire, in England generally, Halloween wasn't celebrated at all. Next day, or Saints' Day would be, but not Halloween. So it didn't mean anything at all. Anyway, he did his service in Ashbourne on the Sunday morning. He went home and had his dinner, and then went down to the stable to get his horse ready to go off to Hartington, where he was supposed to be preaching that evening. But things don't always work out, do they? When he got down to the stable, his horse had gone lame. He couldn't possibly ride it all the way to Hartington. It's about 10 miles, Ashbourne to Hartington. So he decided he wasn't going to be put off. He decided he'd walk. Nowadays, if you wanted to walk from Ashbourne to Hartington, it would be quite a nice walk. Most of it would be on special walking trails, and there'd be boardwalks over the boggy bits and steps up the hills. Some of it would be on an old disused railway track, which is now a pedestrian cyclist footpath. But in those days, no, it would have been very rocky, hard terrain. But he wasn't going to be put off. He was going to go. And he was hoping he'd get there nice and early so that he could have a meal with his friends. He'd preached in Hartington lots of times before and was on good terms with the people there. So off he went, bearing in mind that this was the end of October. It gets dark early. It was quite a grim day weather-wise. The sky was dark. It looked as though it might rain. But he set off and it was all right. He got as far as the little hamlet of Thorpe. He went past the great conical hill of Thorpe Cloud, and by now it was quite dim and dark up above, thick black clouds. The wind was beginning to pick up. He got into the beginnings of Dovedale and made his way through there, and the rain started coming down. Absolute torrential rain, blowing straight down into his face. His coat and hat were blowing out behind him. Bent down, walking into the rain. And after a while, he began to doubt whether he was actually on the path or whether he'd strayed off it. And then he started to think, Dovedale, there's some cliffs. He didn't fancy going off Lover's Leap in the darkness and the rain and the wind. He suddenly remembered a friend of his who'd started doing the newfangled craze of rock climbing, and he'd said it wasn't the falling off he was scared of, it was hitting the ground after he'd fallen off. And this began to get him a bit worried. More so when he thought, I'm not on a path, I'm just making my way between the boulders, and the easiest way through the heather. And he thought, well, perhaps the safest thing I can do is find some shelter. Perhaps I better find a cave or a shepherd's hut or something like that. But even better if I could find a house, but if he was on his route, there weren't any houses anywhere near the route that he was supposed to be on. But then, up the bank, he saw a little glimmer of light. Was it a light? Was it just a stray beam of sun coming through the clouds? No, it was definitely a little glimmer of light, something like a candle. Perhaps it was another benighted traveller taking shelter somewhere, but no, as he got closer, it seemed to be a house. And in fact, it was one of those big old Derbyshire farmsteads that you see sometimes, where there's a house and a barn and animal sheds and field all clustered around the square in the middle. got near it and he tripped over a bit of broken wall. This was a very derelict farmstead. Lots of it had fallen down. Some of it looked as though it was falling down. But in the corner there was part of the house which was still standing. Looked as though it was still lived in. And that's where this little flickery candlelight was shining from. So he went up and hammered on the door. And it took quite a lot of hammering before anyone answered the door. They obviously didn't hear him with the wind and the rain howling around the outside. And the door opened and a young couple stood there and they invited him in. Come in, quick, get out of this weather. What are you doing here in the middle of this terrible storm that's raging around us? Come in, come and get dry, come and get warm. And they took his boots and his coat and sat him down in front of the fire and helped him to get warm, gave him a hot drink. And he explained who he was. He was the preacher and he was on his way to Hartington. And they said, well, you'll never get there on a night like this. You're way off your track and we can't possibly help you find your way either there or back to Ashbourne on a night like this. So they decided they'd give him a meal and he could stay the night. And a lovely meal they had, not banquet, but just poor, simple food, but he really enjoyed it. And they sat in front of the fire and they talked and he probably preached. And they explained, the young couple explained, that they were able to live in this house free of charge just in return for stopping it from falling down, keeping in reasonable sort of repair. And he tried to find out a bit more about it, why is it falling down? Why isn't anyone else here? And they wouldn't say very much. They just said, no one wants to live here, but wouldn't enlarge on that, why or anything. And then with the meal and the drink and the heat from the fire, he began to feel drowsy, and so they took him up and showed him into the bedroom. Obviously, once upon a time it had been a really grand room with plaster around the ceilings and a great big fireplace that you could stand up in, and there was a big four-poster bed, and he jumped into this bed, really soft and comfortable, and he fell fast asleep. But in the early hours of the morning he woke up, he realised he was feeling hungry, and he remembered that down on the table in the kitchen there'd been the remains of a loaf and a chunk of cheese. And he thought they wouldn't mind if he went down and had a bit of that and a glass of water. So he opened the bedroom door and went out onto the landing and he heard voices. And it wasn't just the couple of voices of the couple who lived there, but it seemed to be a lot of voices. Well, how can there be a lot of people here on a night like this, way out in the wilds of nowhere? And as he went down the stairs, these voices got louder and he could hear the clink of glasses and laughter. And he got to the kitchen door and it sounded as though there was a party going on in the kitchen. And sure enough, he opened the door and the kitchen was full of people, full of candles and lights, people standing, eating, drinking, laughing, all done up in finery. And he was greeted by a tall man all dressed in green. He said, come in, come and have something to eat, come and join us, have some food, have some drink. And well, the reason he got up was that he was hungry. So he piled himself up a plate of food, and before he started to eat, he was a parson, he was a preacher. So he always said grace before he ate. So he put the plate on the table, put his hands together and said, thank you for this drink and food. Keep me from harm and make me good. I hope for heaven when I die, and may all devils fear and fly. And the room went silent, and he opened his eyes. Empty, no one there. No food on the table, no drink, no candles, no lights, no sign of any party going on at all. And he shook his head and realised, I've been dreaming. I was dreaming about being hungry. I sleepwalked down to the kitchen. I dreamt there was a party going on, but there isn't. Of course there isn't. So he helped himself to a bit of the bread and cheese, a drink of water, went back to bed and went back to sleep. And in the morning he told the couple who lived there about this silly dream he'd had and how he'd sleepwalked down to the kitchen and how silly it was of him. And they sort of gave each other knowing looks but didn't say anything else about it. And by now in the morning the storm had passed. It was quite a nice morning, the weather was fine, and so they set him on his route, showed him the way to go back to Ashbourne, And off he went and forgot all about it. That was the end of the whole adventure as far as he was concerned. He carried on his usual routine. Other Sundays he'd go to other places to preach. He probably went back to Hartington to preach again on another occasion. But I happen to know now that if you retraced his route, if you managed to find the way he went, and you came across that old farmstead as it is now, it isn't an old ruin at all. It changed hands several times, and every owner upgraded it, made it modern. And if you wanted to buy it now, it's a real state-of-the-art, top of the 21st century house that anyone would love to buy if they were rich enough, and you'd have to be pretty rich to buy it. Because ever since the preacher said grace, the reason that no one wants to live here have all gone away. And that's the story of the Ashbourne preacher.